So the clients have looked around the internet, they've looked around the exhibition, they've looked around your website, and they've chosen you. And they're going to ask, well, can I afford it? How much does it cost? And from your point of view, how do you get to a pricing point? It's not easy. And I see over a career, this is a progression. When you're starting out, because personal recommendation matters, because you need to build a portfolio of work, I think you price to sell. You just need to get the work out there. And then you start to get the commissions in, and you're serious about this, and you need to price to make a living. And that goes well, and you start to have to manage waiting lists. And when you feel the commissions coming in, that's a good time to just edge your prices up. So that's a measure of size of price, stage of career, and really the aims of what you're trying to do with your pricing. Different artists have different techniques, and different techniques take different amounts of time to produce. So looking at these three, the number of hours that have gone into them are very different. Tom Coates will have done this watercolour in a matter of hours. But Keith Breeden will use 26 layers of glazes typically for his oil paintings. And so it would take him much more time. Or somebody like Robin Lee Hall working in egg tempera with those minute brush strokes. And so part of pricing, particularly at the early stages, has to be how many hours does it take? And can I afford to do this? Pricing isn't a science, it is an art form. And you kind of put a lot of ingredients into the mix, shake it up, try something, see if it feels right. That's internally, until you feel comfortable. Because once you've published a price, it's out there and it's hard to retract from it. It's much easier to go up than it is to come down. Publicly, retreating on prices doesn't look so good. So as I mentioned before, creating a portfolio and marketing would be downward pressure. Pounds per hour is upwards. Market price, what's everyone else charging? Have you sold before? What's your benchmark? Who are you selling to? Because if you're selling to people without a lot of expendable money, then you can't charge more than they can pay. But if you attract a very wealthy clientele, then there's a bit more room there. Pressure of work. As soon as you feel the pressure of work, well, maybe it's time to go up a bit. Other things to bear in mind, if you're working with an agent, you need to make allowance for commission. And professional artists like to keep a level price across all the platforms. VAT registration, VAT is an awful bore. It's not just expensive, it's very time consuming to administer. But if you hit that, you need to price that in. Our artists usually price it on top, so it's X plus VAT. But if you get near VAT, you do need to be clear about what's going on. And expenses. You can't really include expenses in a portrait in that you don't know what they're going to be. Sometimes the frame is part of the work, so it does get included. But if it's something that the client has a part in or adds on, they might want a very elaborate hand-carved, hand-gilded frame at thousands of pounds, or they might want a simple wooden frame for much less. So that is a separate and additional item. Same with any travel or accommodation. So expenses, keep them separate, just keep the knowables within your fee structure, and then be clear about it with the client. So the client has come to you, they know roughly what you're about, what are going to be the questions they're going to ask next when they're getting quite close to commissioning. They do need to know what you're going to charge. They need to feel safe with the decisions they're making. So if they suddenly decide to add a cat, a dog, a house, or something complex, they need to know how much or whether you're going to add to your pricing for that. And they don't want to embarrass themselves by diving into something they can't afford. So you do need to give information so people feel safe. I think we've gone through a bit of things that are not included. Extra things, extra people. Some artists feel that extra people are actually quite helpful because if you have a lot of figures in a space, you pay less attention to the head and it becomes more of a conversation piece, and they like them. So they don't add much per extra person. Other artists think, well, that's 2 portraits and a portrait of a relationship between 2 people. And if any of those things goes wrong, well, I've got to start again. And so the amount extra per extra figure goes up. So the difference is between 10% and 75% extra would be rules of thumb. But as you know, as artists, there are no rules for artists. Everyone's different. Payment stages. Very often, an artist will take a commission, and that keeps the relationship safe. You know the client is serious about completing the journey, and it helps with the cash flow, and it looks professional. But for a lot of artists, this doesn't work out. They much prefer a more fluid, more personal relationship, and you either take it or leave it on completion. And those decisions are very personal to the artist as to how you work on this front. Always have a quote. It's so important to manage expectations. So once you've agreed with your client what the parameters are, what you're going to do, it's good to get this in writing with what you're going to do and how much it's going to cost, so that everybody knows what's going to happen and there are no misplaced expectations. Clients are always interested in timing. It doesn't mean that it's make or break. They often will put a completion date up front really early. But if you think you're going to take 6 months, it's probably wise to say 7 in case you're ill or go on holiday or something else jumps in, so the client doesn't feel that they're unimportant and slipping in the queue. The other interesting one is how much do they get involved? Because if you're not experienced with commissions, you may not know how it feels to have somebody feeding back to you about something that they are a co-participant in. Some artists actually won't let their clients see their portrait till it's finished, partly because it's not finished and therefore any comment's not relevant, but often because they get so concerned about pleasing the client that it throws the whole portrait off. So that's a personal thing to think about, how much you're going to let the client be involved along the journey. Too much client involvement over the journey, I feel, can be very complicated and can make for a bit of a camel. It doesn't mean you don't collaborate. It's important to be engaged all the way, but it's something that you need to be aware that you're managing. And then the sign-off, particularly if you're dealing with an institute, signing off with an individual is easy. Very often it's sending over a JPEG for approval. And then if everybody's happy, which they usually are, it's the bill, and then you deliver the work. But if you're dealing with an institution, it's not always very clear whose sign-off it is. Is it the sitter? Is it the person organising the commission? Is it a committee? Or is it the head of the organisation? So it's as well to identify that quite early on and what the procedures are for getting the work approved.